Tell him I did everything I could. But now it's too late.
You think your medals can save you? This is not a battlefield, Captain.
Judge laughs at crying veteran in court but has no idea who's about to walk in. The gavel's harsh bang echoed through the Montgomery courthouse as Judge Harold Grayson's cruel laughter filled the air. Marine veteran Daniel Hayes stood trembling before the bench, tears streaming down his face as he tried to explain his actions. But Grayson had no idea that in moments a figure from his own past would walk through those courtroom doors and change everything forever. The Montgomery County Courthouse stood like a monument to Southern justice, its imposing columns and marble steps speaking to decades of legal proceedings that had shaped the community's understanding of right and wrong. On this sweltering June morning in 2025, the building's air conditioning struggled against the Alabama heat, creating an atmosphere that felt as oppressive as the legal proceedings taking place within its walls. The courtroom itself was a study in faded grandeur, with worn wooden benches, fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows, and the kind of institutional beige paint that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who entered seeking justice. Daniel Hayes stood at the defendant's table, his 38-year-old frame carrying the invisible weight of battles fought both overseas and at home. The former Marine's dark skin showed the stress lines that came from years of struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, unemployment, and the daily challenge of readjusting to civilian life after 3 deployments to Afghanistan. His clothes, while clean and pressed, spoke of limited resources. A second-hand suit that didn't quite fit shoes that had been polished to hide their age, and the kind of careful grooming that indicated someone who understood the importance of making a good impression despite having little to work with. The charges against Daniel stem from an incident at O'Malley's bar the previous month, where he had allegedly assaulted another patron during what witnesses described as an unprovoked attack. The police report painted a picture of a volatile veteran who had lost control in a crowded establishment, shoving Marcus Thompson to the ground and causing a disturbance that required intervention from bar security. But the report failed to capture the context that had led to Daniel's actions, the systematic harassment of a female coworker that had triggered his protective instincts and ultimately landed him in this courtroom. Judge Harold Grayson presided over the proceedings with the kind of casual authority that came from 23 years on the bench. At 55, he had developed a reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who showed little patience for what he considered excuses or emotional appeals. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his robes immaculate, and his demeanor suggested someone who viewed his courtroom as a stage where he was both director and star performer. The local legal community respected his efficiency and feared his sharp tongue, but few understood the personal demons that had shaped his often harsh approach to justice. When Daniel's court-appointed attorney called him to testify on his own behalf, the veteran's voice shook with emotion as he tried to explain what had happened that night. "Your Honor, I know what I did looks bad, but I was trying to protect Sarah, my co-worker." He began, his words coming in halting sentences as he struggled to maintain his composure. The man was harassing her, touching her without permission, and when I asked him to stop, he got aggressive. As Daniel continued his testimony, describing how the incident had triggered memories of his time in Afghanistan, where he had lost his closest friend to an IED explosion, his voice broke completely. Tears began streaming down his face as he spoke about the nightmares, the hypervigilance, and the constant struggle to control his reactions to situations that reminded him of combat. The vulnerability he displayed was raw and genuine, the kind of emotional honesty that should have evoked compassion from anyone who witnessed it. Instead, Judge Grayson's response was a bark of dismissive laughter that cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Crying, Mr. Hayes, this is a court of law, not a war movie," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and contempt. "Save the theatrics for someone who might be impressed by them." "Hardo," the judge's words were met with scattered chuckles from some observers in the gallery, though others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly disturbed by the callous treatment of a man who had served his country. Daniel's head dropped in shame, his shoulders sagging as the judge's mockery hit him like a physical blow. The humiliation was complete and devastating, stripping away what little dignity he had managed to maintain throughout the legal proceedings. The prosecutor, emboldened by the judge's obvious bias, pressed for the maximum sentence, arguing that Daniel's military service was irrelevant to his criminal behavior, and that veterans should not receive special treatment under the law. Lorraine Washington observed the proceedings from her seat in the gallery with growing outrage and determination. At 70 years old, the retired civil rights attorney had seen enough injustice in her 5 decades of legal practice to recognize it instantly, and what she was witnessing in Judge Grayson's courtroom was a clear violation of basic human dignity. She had come to the courthouse that morning at the request of a friend who worked with the local veterans support group, expecting to provide moral support for a struggling veteran. Instead, she found herself witnessing an abuse of judicial power that demanded immediate action. Lorraine's distinguished career had been built on defending the rights of those who couldn't defend themselves, and her reputation for taking on seemingly impossible cases had made her a legend in Alabama's legal community. Though officially retired, she maintained her bar membership and her extensive network of contacts throughout the state's political and legal establishment. More importantly, she possessed the kind of moral authority that came from decades of fighting for justice, even when it was unpopular or dangerous to do so. When the court recessed for lunch, Lorraine approached Daniel in the hallway outside the courtroom, her presence commanding despite her age. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Lorraine Washington," she said, extending her hand with the kind of firm handshake that immediately communicated strength and reliability. "I think you could use some help, and I think I'm the person to provide it." Daniel looked up at her with eyes that held more desperation than hope, the morning's humiliation having drained him of any belief that his situation could improve. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I can't afford a real lawyer," he said quietly. "I'm just going to plead guilty and get this over with. I can't take much more of this." Lorraine's expression softened as she recognized the defeated tone in Daniel's voice, the same hopelessness she had heard from countless clients over the years who had been ground down by a system that seemed designed to crush rather than uplift. "Son, I've been fighting battles like this since before you were born," she said gently. "You served your country with honor, and now it's time for your country to serve you. Let me worry about the legal fees." The investigation that Lorraine launched into Daniel's case revealed layers of complexity that had been completely ignored by both the prosecution and Daniel's overworked public defender. The video that had been circulating on social media showing Daniel pushing Marcus Thompson had been edited to remove the crucial context that explained his actions. The full security footage from O'Malley's bar told a very different story, one that painted Daniel not as an aggressor, but as a protector who had intervened when he witnessed a clear case of sexual harassment. Lorraine's contacts in the legal community helped her obtain the complete security footage, which showed Marcus Thompson systematically harassing Sarah Mitchell, Daniel's co-worker, for over an hour before Daniel's intervention. The footage revealed Thompson grabbing Sarah inappropriately, making lewd comments, and ignoring her repeated requests to leave her alone. Daniel's decision to intervene had been measured and proportional, with multiple attempts to de-escalate the situation before any physical contact occurred. But perhaps more importantly, Lorraine's investigation revealed information about Daniel's military service that painted a picture of heroism rather than instability. His service records showed multiple commendations for valor, including a Bronze Star for actions that had saved the lives of 6 fellow Marines during an ambush in Helmand Province. The incident that had triggered his PTSD had occurred when he had risked his own life to recover the body of his best friend after an IED explosion, ensuring that the man's family would have closure and the dignity of a proper burial. Armed with this information, Lorraine began preparing a defense strategy that would not only exonerate Daniel, but also expose the systematic bias that had led to his persecution. She reached out to her network of contacts in the veterans community, including former military officers who could testify to Daniel's character and service record. But her most important call was to Colonel Thomas Reed, Daniel's former commanding officer, who had personally recommended him for the Bronze Star. Colonel Reed, now 67 and serving as a military advisor to various veterans organizations, remembered Daniel as one of the finest Marines he had ever commanded. When Lorraine explained the situation, Reed's response was immediate and unequivocal. He would travel to Montgomery to testify on Daniel's behalf, and he would bring with him the kind of moral authority that could not be dismissed or ignored. The preparation for the final hearing required careful coordination between Lorraine, Colonel Reed, and the small group of supporters who had rallied around Daniel's case. The local veterans community had been mobilized by social media posts about the case, with many former service members recognizing their own struggles in Daniel's story. The courtroom would be packed with supporters, but Lorraine knew that the real battle would be fought through evidence and testimony that could not be dismissed by Judge Grayson's prejudices. Daniel himself had begun to change during the weeks leading up to the final hearing. The support he had received from Lorraine and the veterans community had begun to restore his sense of self-worth, reminding him that he was more than the sum of his mistakes and struggles. He had started attending support group meetings at the local Veterans Center, where he found others who understood his experiences and could offer practical advice for managing his PTSD symptoms. But Lorraine had one more surprise in store for the final hearing, something that she had discovered during her research into Judge Grayson's background. The judge's harsh treatment of veterans was not random cruelty, but something more personal rooted in his own experiences as a Vietnam veteran who had never properly processed his own trauma. Grayson had served as a combat medic in Vietnam, had witnessed horrors that had shaped his worldview, and had developed his own struggles with PTSD that he had never acknowledged or treated. The revelation of Judge Grayson's military service had been carefully hidden throughout his legal career, mentioned only in passing in old newspaper articles from his early days as a prosecutor. But Lorraine's research had uncovered the truth Grayson had once been, where Daniel was now struggling with invisible wounds and societal misunderstanding. The difference was that Grayson had been able to hide his struggles behind professional success and social status, while Daniel had been forced to confront his demons in public. The final hearing began with Judge Grayson displaying the same dismissive attitude that had characterized the earlier proceedings. He clearly expected a quick resolution to the case, with Daniel accepting a plea bargain that would allow everyone to move on without further drama. The courtroom was packed with supporters, including dozens of veterans who had come to show solidarity with Daniel, but Grayson seemed oblivious to the significance of their presence. When Daniel took the stand for what everyone expected to be his final testimony, his voice was stronger than it had been during the previous hearing. The weeks of support and preparation had given him confidence, and he spoke clearly about his actions on the night in question. "Your Honor, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan because I believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves," he said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found his purpose again. "That night at O'Malley's, I saw someone being hurt, and I did what I was trained to do. I intervened to protect her." Judge Grayson's response was predictably harsh. "Here we go with the war stories again," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Mr. Hayes, your military service doesn't give you the right to assault civilians. Save the tears for someone who cares." The judge's cruelty was even more pronounced than before, as if he was determined to crush any remaining spirit in the veteran standing before him. It was at that moment that the courtroom doors opened and Colonel Thomas Reed entered with the kind of commanding presence that could silence a room simply through force of personality. Dressed in his military dress uniform with ribbons and medals that spoke to a lifetime of distinguished service, Reed walked down the center aisle with purpose and dignity. Every eye in the courtroom followed his progress, including Judge Grayson's, whose expression shifted from dismissive arrogance to something approaching concern. "Your Honor, I request permission to address the court," Colonel Reed said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of command responsibility. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as everyone waited to see how Judge Grayson would respond to this unexpected development. Colonel Reed's testimony transformed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. Speaking with the precision and authority of a career military officer, he described Daniel's service record in detail, painting a picture of heroism and sacrifice that stood in stark contrast to the criminal narrative that had been constructed around the bar incident. He presented evidence of Daniel's Bronze Star citation, reading aloud the specific actions that had earned him the military's 4th highest decoration for valor. Staff Sergeant Hayes risked his own life to save 6 of his fellow Marines during an enemy ambush. Reed testified, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. He displayed the kind of courage and selflessness that defines the very best of American military service. "The man standing before you is not a criminal. He is a hero who has been failed by the very system he served to protect." But it was Reed's direct address to Judge Grayson that provided the moment of truth that changed everything. Looking directly at the judge, Reed's voice took on a tone of personal recognition and challenge. "Harold, I know you served in Vietnam as a combat medic. I know you understand what it means to carry the invisible wounds of war. You once struggled with the same demons that Daniel faces every day. How can you sit in judgment of him when you know exactly what he's going through? The revelation that Judge Grayson was a fellow veteran sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Most people present had no idea about the judge's military service, which he had carefully hidden throughout his legal career out of concern that it might be seen as a weakness or liability. The exposure of his secret created a moment of vulnerability that stripped away his judicial authority and revealed the man beneath the robes. Grayson's face went pale as Reed continued his testimony, describing how the judge had once been treated for PTSD after his return from Vietnam, and how that treatment had been kept confidential to protect his career prospects. The parallel between Grayson's situation and Daniel's was unmistakable, and the judge's harsh treatment of the veteran suddenly appeared not as professional detachment, but as personal cruelty born from his own unresolved trauma. The moment of truth came when Reed played the complete security footage from O'Malley's bar, showing clearly that Daniel had acted to protect a woman from sexual harassment rather than committing an unprovoked assault. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but more importantly, it was presented in a context that made Daniel's actions appear heroic rather than criminal. As the footage played, showing Daniel's measured response to Marcus Thompson's aggressive behavior, the courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause. Even some of the court personnel who had witnessed Judge Grayson's treatment of Daniel during the earlier hearings seemed moved by the evidence of the veteran's true character and motivations. Judge Grayson sat in the stunned silence as the applause died down, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to process what had just occurred. The exposure of his own military service and PTSD struggles had stripped away his ability to hide behind judicial authority, forcing him to confront the hypocrisy of his treatment of Daniel. The parallel between their experiences was too clear to ignore, and the judge's harsh words about Daniel's emotional testimony now appeared as attacks on his own younger self. When Reed finished his testimony by embracing Daniel in front of the entire courtroom, the gesture carried symbolic weight that transcended the legal proceedings. It was a moment of recognition and validation that Daniel had been seeking throughout his struggle with civilian life, confirmation that his service and sacrifice had meaning and value that could not be diminished by one night's actions in a bar. Judge Grayson's final ruling came after several minutes of visible internal struggle. His voice shaking with emotion, he dismissed all charges against Daniel and issued a public apology that acknowledged both the veteran's service and his own failures as a judge. "Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology that I should have offered weeks ago," he said, his judicial authority replaced by human humility. "Your service to our country deserves recognition, not ridicule, and I failed you in the most fundamental way possible." The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and profound. What had begun as a proceeding designed to punish a troubled veteran had become a moment of healing and recognition that touched everyone present. Daniel's vindication was complete, but more importantly, it had been achieved in a way that created lasting change rather than simply resolving a single case. The aftermath of the hearing created ripple effects that extended far beyond Daniel's individual case. Judge Grayson's public acknowledgement of his own PTSD struggles and his commitment to seeking treatment created a powerful example for other veterans who had been hiding their own wounds. The local veterans community, energized by the success of Daniel's case, organized to provide better support systems for former service members facing legal challenges. Lorraine Washington's role in orchestrating Daniel's vindication led to her return to active legal practice, specializing in cases involving veterans' rights and judicial misconduct. Her network of contacts and her reputation for taking on impossible cases made her a powerful advocate for those who had been failed by the system. Colonel Reed's intervention in the case had reminded everyone present of the bonds that connected military service members across generations and conflicts. His willingness to stand up for Daniel demonstrated the kind of leadership and loyalty that defined the military community at its best. For Daniel himself, the experience had been transformative in ways that extended far beyond his legal vindication. The support he had received from the veterans community had helped him reconnect with his sense of purpose and belonging, while the public recognition of his military service had restored his damaged self-esteem. 6 months after the hearing, Daniel had found stable employment as a counselor at the local Veterans Center, where his own experiences with PTSD and legal challenges made him uniquely qualified to help others facing similar struggles. His story had become an inspiration to other veterans who felt abandoned by the system they had served, proving that justice was possible even when it seemed hopeless. Judge Grayson had undergone his own transformation, seeking treatment for his long-suppressed PTSD and working to change the way his court handled cases involving veterans. His experience with Daniel had forced him to confront his own demons and had ultimately made him a more compassionate and effective judge. On a warm autumn evening, as Daniel led a support group meeting at the Veterans Center, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from despair to hope. The courtroom that had once been a place of humiliation had become the site of his redemption, and the judge who had mocked his tears had become an unlikely ally in his struggle for justice. Lorraine Washington, now in her 70s but showing no signs of slowing down, continued to fight for veterans' rights with the same passion that had defined her entire career. Her intervention in Daniel's case had reminded her of why she had become a lawyer in the first place, and she approached each new case with renewed energy and purpose. The lesson of Daniel's story, that justice could prevail even against seemingly impossible odds, had spread throughout the veterans community and beyond. It served as a reminder that courage could take many forms, from the battlefield heroism that had earned Daniel his Bronze Star to the moral courage that had driven Lorraine to take on his case when no one else would. The judge who had once laughed at a crying veteran had learned that sometimes the most powerful moments in a courtroom came not from displays of authority, but from acts of compassion and understanding that recognized the shared humanity of all those who appeared before the bench seeking justice.